Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be working through a guided watercolor that's called the Phoenix Rondel. Now this is a copy of a piece that's in the Palace Museum in Hong Kong, and it's on a beautiful ceremonial robe made for one of the imperial concubines of the Qing dynasty. And it's absolutely beautiful. The original piece is done in yellow silk with beautiful threads and embroidery going through, and I've basically taken the same pattern idea and made it into a painting rondelle. And this is a guided watercolor class. So what guided watercolor is when I'm teaching watercolor, I'm finding that people get very stressed about doing the drawing first. So guided watercolor is created for people who don't do a lot of drawing in the first place, want to learn how to paint in general, but maybe want to step into the painting part because it's a bit more exciting right away, rather than going through the drawing steps to start with, which is just fine. So I've created these guided watercolor, and it comes in a kit. The kit includes all the paint that you're going to need. It includes paint brushes, or rather paint brushes can be added on if you don't already have them. And it includes a printed paper like this. We'll learn how to lay the paint on, what steps and procedure that we'll use to make the painting, and then you'll be able to try it out yourself. So you can follow along, or you can watch the video and then try it yourself a little bit later. So the paint that we're going to be using, we have 5 different colors of paint for this. We have the Hong Kong Color Lab, that's the 001 yellow gold, filled with mica, and it gives it that really beautiful shiny texture. If you look at this sample piece, it's got a lot of shine on it, you can see. Beautiful, beautiful paint. Then we have a Cadmium Yellow Deep, which is this yellow here that we're using. We've got a Sap Green. We've got a Permanent Matter Lake, and we've got an Ultramarine Deep. Now these are all artist quality watercolors, so that means that they have a high pigment value, and the binder is really good. Pigment and the binder and the modality agent are 3 sort of main ingredients in watercolor paint, and these ones are very good quality. So if you've ever tried to paint with watercolor and found it really frustrating, chances are you're using not such great paint in the first place. And you'll notice that, we've got very definite colors of green and red and blue, and then you've got some sort of darker parts and lighter parts. And then we've got that gold underlying everything else. What we're going to do to paint this is we're going to start off with one color, and then we're going to, work on one area, and we're going to go across. It doesn't really matter which area or which color you start with, except the gold. We're going to put the gold on last because we have to actually paint in between all these pieces. And if you paint in between the pieces, you've got a nice flow, nice water going on, and you hit the gold, sometimes that mica can travel on the water, and then it just all becomes a bit shimmery, which, isn't the world's worst thing to happen. In this video as well, I'm not going to completely finish because it does take quite a long time. Now these are meant to be sort of quite meditative pieces, so take your time with them. You can practice as well on the back of the paper. It won't soak through, so if you want to practice a few strokes and get used to your paintbrush and how your paintbrush works, on the back of the paper is the perfect place to do this. Okay, so let's just kind of get started. You will need a few other tools. So you'll need the kit, which is the paint and the pre-drawn piece. You'll also need a glass of clean water, whatever you want that to look like, a glass of clean water, which you can always replenish as well, though this isn't that messy of a painting. And you'll probably want a piece of kitchen roll, towel, something that can absorb some water off your brush. Now this just helps you to control how much water goes in. It's called watercolor, and it's all about controlling the amount of water, the amount of pigment on your paper. The paper itself is 100% cotton paper, watercolor paper, and it's quite a good quality. I always use a very high-grade watercolor paper because one of the most frustrating things with starting watercolor is people often go for student quality paints, and then they get really crummy paints, and it's really difficult because they don't move in the way that you want them to, or they get really crummy paper. And again, it's the same thing, right? It doesn't move the way you want it to move. Now, I'm looking at my sample here, and if you want to look at a sample while you're painting, you can go onto the website. The link is below, and there's a sample painting there for you to have a look at. So I'm looking at my sample painting, and I think that I will start down here with this bottom piece here. Here's the phoenix and the eye. And I think I'm going to start down here with this bottom piece. I'm going to put my number 6 brush away. I've got a number 2 brush. This is a watercolor brush, so it comes to a very nice point at the end, but it actually holds quite a lot of paint. What you're looking for in a watercolor brush is that rounded tip, and when you do get it nice and wet, and you do want to make sure the water goes all the way through the brush, you'll be able to bring it to a nice tip. But it still holds quite a lot of water in the brush itself. So that was what makes a really good watercolor brush. And I've got a number 2 and a number 6. That's plenty. I probably won't even use the number 6. I'll probably mostly use the number 2 for this one. This is plenty of watercolor paint to finish off your drawing, or your painting rather. And I've got everything that I need here: my water, my tissue, my paint, my gold paint, which I'm not actually going to use for a little while, so I'm going to move it off of there, and my piece of paper. So I get started with this. The first thing that I'm going to do, because I want quite a soft color for this green in here to start with. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually take the water, just water. I haven't put any color or pigment on my brush yet. Take this water and I just go in there and wet that part right there. If you do this wet on wet, it means that the water and the pigment will work together and will draw itself around. And I just want to make it as easy as possible on myself to start with. And also, you know, if I make a huge mistake and I go way outside of the lines, I can wait for it to dry for a minute or two, and then I can go back to it again. Watercolor is about control. Controlling your paper, controlling your drying time, controlling your water, controlling your pigment. So all of that control together adds up to beautiful watercolor. And some of it is about, once you learn how to master and control, you can learn how to let go and where to not control, which is where the most beautiful watercolor often comes in, the more spontaneous stuff. But just like with any painting, it's often very important for you to learn control before you can learn how to lose control. Now you'll notice that I keep dipping into the water. I want to make sure that my brush is wet. I'm looking at my paper and I can see the shine of the water on it sometimes. And I just want to make sure that it kind of gets as even as possible so that the water goes all the way through, but there's not giant clumps of it everywhere. I want it to be fairly even. And then I'm going to go in, I'm going to wet my brush again. You'll see me dipping into the water all the time. When I reach over here, it's dipping into the water. Also, if you here's a pro tip. If you're drinking tea or coffee, it goes on the side that your non-dominant hand is on. Otherwise, you end up putting your paintbrush into the tea and coffee. And I've just activated a bit of that color. That means that I've gotten it mixed with the water, and it's on my brush now. And I'm just going to go through and put that water with the pigment onto the part that I've already painted on. Now it goes on there very, very smoothly and well, and it's blending in very well because the paper's already just a tiny bit wet in that spot. So here we go. And I want to be fairly careful with it. If you like doing things like you like making puzzles or you like drawing mandalas, this is a really lovely way of doing it. In fact, I was very inspired. I have some very good friends who love doing puzzles, and I quite enjoy puzzles as well, although I haven't found a huge amount of time for them in recent years. But I quite like doing puzzles as well, and I was inspired because I love doing puzzles, but then at the end of it, you break them up and put them back in the box. And the good thing about that is you can do it over and over again. This is a one only. But the good thing about this is at the end of all that sort of meditative practice, you end up with a picture. And that's kind of wonderful in itself. Now this is only the way that I want to do it. and I will paint this kind of a painting. There might be more than one way. There isn't necessarily a right way or a wrong way. You just kind of do what you need to do for it. There we go. We'll get that in there. Good. And come around the curve here. Bit more water. I can feel when my paintbrush runs out of pigment, then I need more water and then more pigment. If you just put pigment on without the water, you're just going to end up with a really dark smudge. So water and pigment. If you want to see how much pigment you have, you can always wipe a little bit off on your towel. There we go. And I don't mind keeping that nice hard edge on there. There we go. Perfect. So I'm quite pleased with that. That looks pretty good. And the next one to do, I've got green on my brush. I've got green already on here. I don't want to go and do this part right here right away. First of all, it's yellow, so it's not a color I want to use right at the moment, but also because it's right next to this green. And now if I go and I touch that green with a different color, that color is more likely to move into each other. These watercolor paints want to flow together, so it wants to go into its neighbor on the side, right? And I don't necessarily want it to go in there. So that's the first one I did. I put water on it first and then I painted over top of it. I can change how it looks, maybe make it look a little bit more embroidered. If I want to go back and throw a little bit more color onto it, I can make it more graded in color, like this. Now that looks like quite a lumpy bit, so I take the paint and the water off of my brush and I just pull that pigment around and I can smooth it out. And that's going to leave a slightly darker line on the top there. It does change a little bit. Things darken up a little bit when they dry out, but generally you can see what's happening. Also with watercolor, you can go back and change the color a little bit by just using water. You can pull some of that color off the paper as well. Again, if you tried this before and had very little success, then it's probably because your paper isn't very good. If you're using a cellulose paper, which is really cheap, and very attractive for that reason, right? You're thinking, well, I don't want to pay this much money for a paper when I don't know how to paint. But unfortunately, the paper makes so much difference here. Now, I haven't put water on this one yet, but I'm feeling a little bit more confident because I've had to go with one, and so I'm just painting directly on it. However, I've got quite a lot of water on my brush, so that's going quite well. It's going quite smoothly, and I'm just kind of pushing the water around, and the water happens to have pigment in it, so I'm pushing the water around with the pigment in it, which is handy. Okay, I want a little bit more pigment in there. I can throw it on top of the water. And say throw it on, but I'm very carefully brushing it on, right, with the tip of the brush. I'm also not doing a lot of this. Right? I want to make sure that I put it on and I don't necessarily go over it a lot. Now you're in control of the material, so if you're finding it's more comfortable to turn the paper like I just did, please do. Never try and paint in a corner if you have the option not to. This one here, I want this tiny little tip up here, and you'll notice that I'm using the tip of the brush a lot. I'm really just, it's almost like you're tickling it with the brush. Sometimes you want to use the flat part of the brush or the sort of stem of the brush, but in this instance, I really just want to pull it along with a little bit of a tickle. Now when I put this on, it looks very, very, very strong, doesn't it? But I'm actually going to take that pigment and pull it out, because it's all suspended in the water there. I'm going to take that pigment and I'm just going to pull it along so it's not so dark right there. And I can paint this whole piece with pretty much the same amount of pigment. If I want a little bit more, I might pull a little bit more up here. And that takes that whole piece, just like that. Pretty good, right? Not bad. Okay. I don't mind that it's not quite smooth because this is copying an embroidery piece. I don't really mind if it's not entirely smooth because the original embroidery was actually made up of tiny little threads. So it's not as smooth either. And one of the things nowadays with lots of digital paintings is you'll find that digital art is always really smooth and perfect. And it's actually really difficult to get imperfections in digital art that look nice. And it's something that, I mean, although I appreciate digital art and find it very attractive a lot of the time, I do miss some of the imperfections. And that's, you know, just a personal preference, but that's the way it goes. Okay, now I've got a little piece in here. This big piece in here is going to be green as well. And I'll just do that one as I'm going through. So you can have yours, you know, you can pull up the reference and you can print it out, or you can just leave it on a screen somewhere that you can refer to. You could even potentially go through and just do a quick reference with little dots of which color is going to go where. It's up to you how you're going to manage that. There we go. I often have my iPad close by when I'm working, and then I can just reference it for that. But at the moment, my iPad's over there recording. Okay. And we've got a little bit up in here and this piece in here that's going to be green as well. Okay. I think I'm just going to work on the head area here to start with, and I'll see how much further I get. So I want to work on one color to start because I don't want to mix the colors too close to one another. I want them to be, you know, a little bit further apart, have some drying time in between. It dries pretty quick. And, you know, when you're a really practiced watercolor painter, you will notice how wet the air is around you, or how wet your paper is, or how, you know, it changes from season to season, how the paint reacts according to the dampness in the air and that sort of thing. So it's kind of wild. I'm going to treat this whole lower part as kind of one piece. I find that sometimes when I'm painting something like this, I need to have a piece that I can complete. Otherwise, I'm going to be searching through the whole thing and looking for only green for the whole thing. And that starts to get to be quite a lot for me. I find it's not as comfortable to try and finish everything all at once. I just don't find it as much fun. So I like to finish like this piece, and then I'll do the wings next, and then I'll maybe do this piece, and then that piece is the last one. We'll see how it goes, but that's the sort of general way that I like to do it. It's up to you how you want to do it, obviously. I'm not there. I can't make you do it my way. But I'm also always so excited to try all the colors and get all the colors in that I'm quite often, you know, really excited, and I don't want to wait around for things. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. I think I've gotten all the green that I can find. However, I am going to go through and put just a little bit more color around here, just because I like to do that part. There we go. I'm going to outline those in gold in a little bit. All right, next color I'll use is, that's nice and dry, so I'm going to go for the yellow next, just because there's only the beak to do in yellow, so it's quite quick. So here's my Phoenix beak. You know, check and make sure where you're going to go before you put the paint on. And my Phoenix beak, I'm going to let it go quite dark. There we go. And let it go quite dark. So there's a lot of pigment. There we are. My street outside, it's very busy. There's just sounds like a race car going by, but I suspect it's just somebody who wishes they were in a race car. It's the way it goes. All right, So the beak is finished, and the next one I have to do, I don't want to do the red necessarily right here, but I could start the red over here on this peony flower here. And the peony flower red is going to be a bit of a gradation of color. So for that, I want to lay down quite a dark color down here. This is the bottom of the petal. So I lay down quite a layer of quite a dark color on there. And again, you have to kind of watch how your paint goes because, you know, if you're called away now, this might stain the paper and you might not be able to pull it out. So I've taken the paint off of my brush again. I've gotten a bit of clear water on it, and I'm going to pull that out, just like that. So I've gone back onto the paint, and I'm just pulling the paint right out with just water. And you can see that leaves a darker line in the back and a lighter line around the top. Now I want to do the next one, but I can't do this one right next to it just yet because it's still wet. And I'm likely to be making, you know, things that go next to one another. And there's another way you can do this, of course. I'm likely to be touching itself, I should say, rather than whatever garbled message that one was. The second method is to take your paint and to take your water rather, and actually put it on quite, you know, strongly. This one's a little bit harder for me to control, so I don't always have success with this. Again, I want to activate that color just by tickling it with the tip of the brush, and I can then go back in and I can put the paint down on here. Gives me a bit of a different feel, but I can always go back and again take most of the water out of my brush, so it's almost dry now, and I can go back and pull that color out. I didn't get as much color in there as I wanted for that one, so I'm going to go back and do it again. It's kind of up to you which method you use, though it's best to use one method all the way through it. So if you choose to put the water on first, or you choose to put the color on first, it's best to use one because then all the other ones will kind of follow along with it. And that makes it a little bit easier, more unified, a bit nicer. So I'm going to go back to my first method. I'm going to put the color right down along the edge here, using the tip of my brush, quite a heavy pigment. And I can do this one at the same time. And there we go. And then I'm going to take that color off, get a bit of water on my brush, but not too much. It's just experimentation, really, that, you know, it doesn't matter if you put more water on or less. And I'm going to pull that pigment up into there. Once that's dry, I can always go back and even take some of the pigment off if I need to, or I can add a bit more pigment. It's up to me how I do it. So I'm not very stressed out about, you know, is there too much, is there not enough? Now I'm going to let that dry for just a moment so that I don't accidentally make it bleed into each other. But next I'm going to go and do these little, I think they're flower buds here. So I'm going to do flower bud, and I'm going to make those quite dark so I can go back in and put quite a lot of color in them. Now this one doesn't have a flower bud in the center, but I've decided I want one. And this one here. Okay, that looks pretty good. This is pretty dry. So I'm going to go back now and put color in there, just like that. There we go. And this one. You find out very soon if they're dry or not because they bleed into each other. There we go. And this last one here. Oh, there's one more over there, but I'm going to leave that for just a moment. And I'm going to take my mostly dry brush and pull that color out to the edges. I want to go in the direction the petal goes. If I go side to side, it's going to change how the color moves. And I want to do it fairly quickly. I don't want to leave it too long because then that paint is going to really set in there, and I don't want that to happen. pull that stuff out and pull it out here again. And the last one there, I didn't put a line on, so I'll go back and do that one now. If you're working on a really big piece, I make sure that I've got a piece of paper to lay my hand down on as well. And I'm very careful not to touch wet parts while I'm moving it around. But I'm working only on this piece. It's a lot easier to deal with. My hands are clean, more or less, as clean as they ever are in the studio. So I'm not that concerned about it today. There we go. You can notice at the edge of the leaves there, or the edge of the petals there, I've left to be a little bit white. It gives a nice feeling to have a little bit of whiteness at the top of that. And again, that's all about control. Get a tiny bit of pigment on here because I want them to be a bit pinker. There we go. That's pretty good. And I can pull the color out, or I can put a little bit more color on top of it. And I've chosen to put a little bit more color on top of it. Here's another one down here. And before I pull the color out for this one, I'm going to let it sit for a minute. Looks pretty good. Got a little tiny one here. You're just tickling it. This is all about, a lot of fine motor control skill here. This is why it's an excellent exercise for young people who are just developing their motor control skills. I remember when I was younger, we got given model painting kits, and they were the same kind of thing. You know, I'm holding my brush so lightly, and being able to kind of hold the brush and have comfort while you're doing this, just letting it go. If it goes over the lines a little bit, it doesn't really matter, but you know, it's a good thing to practice and to work with. It's a nice thing to be able to experiment with, and you know, sometimes it'll go over the lines. Oh well. Now I've put quite a lot of paint on here again, so I'm just going through, getting a bit more water and spreading that pigment out. Okay, spread that pigment out because I don't want it to be so dark. Maybe you do want it to be dark, that's great too, but that's not my choice. Okay, there's another piece down here. I quite like how that's a little bit variegated there, and I'm going to put this piece on here. I want it to stand out a bit from the red next to it, so I am going to leave that bottom piece a little bit lighter, as though they've added white. You'll find that watercolor artists, purists sort of thing, like traditional watercolor, Western style watercolor, we don't use white paint. Using white paint is considered basically cheating. So your paper is white, and that is what you're using. And sometimes it's about, the watercolor painting can be about what you don't paint as well as what you do paint. So the parts that you leave white are often as important as the parts that you color in. So you keep that in mind too while you're working, and see if that changes your attitude towards how you're painting. Now there's a little bit of red in here that goes up into the tail over there. So I'm going to get that one in as well. Just going to go over here like this. And down and around. And a little bit more paint on there. There we go. Perfect. That looks great. Okay, I think I have everything except the face, and I think I'm ready for that face to be painted in now. I'm going to use a bit of color variation to make the whole thing. I want the inside to be a bit darker, the outside to be a bit lighter. Again, it's a personal choice. You could paint this whole picture in one color only if you really wanted to. It doesn't really make much of a difference which colors you use. These are just the colors that were the closest to the embroidery that I took the picture from. It was a beautiful day, the day that we went to the Palace Museum. It was quite an adventure, and it was lovely, and I just loved the Qing Dynasty robes, so I was very pleased to see them, and enjoyed taking reference photos and doing some sketches while I was there. I've done that before. I've made almost life-size sort of copies of the robes by hand, and it's amazing how much copying a picture or an embroidery or a line that somebody else does, it's amazing how much that teaches you about the piece itself. You get a little tiny bit of the creation of it through just experimenting with it. It's quite wild. Okay, so I've got this inside piece here, and I can't really see the eye and the marks around it anymore, but that's okay. I'm going to go back and do that later, either with the really dark red or even with the blue or something contrasting, because the eye is quite special. And I've got quite a lot of water on my brush, and I'm going to go through, and I'm actually going to paint this part on, but I want it even lighter than that. So I want to take some of that paint off. I had too much on there. Quite light, and I'm going to put lots of water on there, and it's just going to be the lightest pink. It doesn't show up very much on the paper as is, but it will show up once I put the color around it. I'm going to use blue on the, I don't know, feather bits around the head, and once that goes on, this pink will be a bit more obviously pink. I haven't waited for that to dry, even though I told you a minute ago that always wait for it to dry, because I don't mind if it bleeds through. I don't mind. It's all the same color. I wouldn't want it to bleed through if it was yellow or green or blue, but with the red on red or the red and pink, I don't mind if it bleeds through a little bit. I'm also going to go through and maybe line those with a little bit of gold later on. Okay, I think I'm ready for some blue. Here we go. And again, it's embroidery, so I'm going to go and line these. I want a little bit more color than that, I think. I quite like this blue. It's a beautiful ultramarine, and it's so nice. Take most of my color off. I still got a little bit of color on the brush, but it doesn't matter that much. And I just go through and let that paint move itself around. There we go. Let that paint move itself around. I got a little bit close to this red here. I think it's dry enough, but it might not be, so I'm just keeping an eye on it to make sure it doesn't bleed through. I'm jumping the gun a little bit here. But I'm quite enjoying how that's going on, so that's good. This is not a fast process. Okay, it is slow. It's a slow process, and that is what makes it lovely. Okay, now I'm holding my brush like this, which is giving me a few problems because I really need the tip of that brush to get into those corners. So I need to hold it up a little bit more vertical, to go into those corners. There we go. I'm always developing new paintings and new ideas, and I'll be going to various museums and galleries and finding ancient treasures to paint and to mimic. But it really gives you a sense of how things were drawn and how they went about doing things when you copy these pieces, when you practice with them. Okay, a little bit more blue here. Each color as well just behaves just slightly differently. Sometimes the red is really staining. Sometimes the green is the hardest one in many ways, because it can be quite translucent when you want it to be dark, and quite dark when you want it to be translucent. Green and I don't always get along when I'm painting. I've gone back and put just a huge amount of pigment right in there, just because I want it to really pop out. Not for any real reason, because I can. And I want it to be a little bit different. So there you go. Okay, and just get those colored in there. I don't want any hard edges in the center here, so you'll see me doing a little bit of scrubbing. That's because when I've left it, it's left a hard edge. This edge down here is a hard edge where it's a very definite cutoff of beginning and end, paper and pigment. And I don't necessarily want that hard edge on everything. I sometimes want the edge to be a little bit softer. There we go. Okay. And let's see. Ooh, that's maybe a bit too much. That's just fine. If I put on too much pigment, let me show you. I put on too much pigment and almost too much water as well, right? It's a bit too much of everything. I just take a little corner of my tissue, I put it on top very carefully, and then I take most of that off. If I wanted to scrub off more of that, I could add some clear water and just dab it again, maybe give it a little scrub, and that would take off even more, but I don't actually want to take off more of that right now. I'm activating a bit more of that blue, and again, I'm going to make this tip quite dark, and then pull that up. Pull that up, I said, and then went down instead. Now I've got this whole feathers around the head are all blue. So now I have to decide how I'm going to differentiate between, one feather and another. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm just going to vary that intensity just a little bit. I'd like the ends to be more intense than the tops. So I'm going to paint them with more intensity here at the end part. More intensity means more paint. And I'll go through and give those all a little bit of color before I pull them up. Now you might want to do them one by one, it's up to you. It depends on how familiar or comfortable you are with the paint too. Some people, they find it really comfortable to move around. Other people like to finish one piece before they move on to the next one. It's a personal preference. Okay, I think I'm just going to get those little bits in there as well. All right, before that dries completely, I'm going to pull it up. A little bit of pigment, lots of water, and pull those up like this. A little bit of pigment, lots of water, and there's space in between these ones for some of that gold paint to go in there and shine. When you're videoing, it's not always easy to see because I don't want to stick my head directly in front of the camera, which I've probably done about 12 times already, but I'm attempting not to. I also forgot to bring my reading glasses, so I'm painting with my bifocals, which means sometimes a challenge. Sometimes it's a challenge. And usually when I'm painting, though not when I'm recording a video, but usually while I'm painting, I'm listening to audiobooks or doing something as well with my head. I find that very meditative and soothing to have somebody read a story to me. It's really quite wonderful. But I do have to have a clear idea of what it is that I'm going to do before I start listening. Otherwise, it just goes off the rails. Here we are. Quite like that. Looks pretty good. And then I've got this big long bit up here and one bit of blue here. Let me do this one first. There we go. A bit too much water and pigment there. I want this one to be a bit lighter. There we are. There's a tiny little hair on my paper there. Tip, don't pull any tiny little hairs off, especially if you have a cat while you're painting. Try leaving it on if you can. If it's not making too much of a blemish, try leaving it on until it's dried and then brushing it off, because you'll chase them around the paper forever. I'm just going to go on these lumpy bits here. I guess these are feathers. And the phoenix is a mythical bird. It's supposed to be a symbol of love and piety and devotion. And so it was often used for women's clothes. The Chinese rondelles from the Qing dynasty, just like I suppose every other bit of royalty or ceremonial garb is filled with symbolism. And the phoenix is often paired with the dragon. The dragon being the man and the phoenix being the female usually. And if you go to a banquet hall for weddings, you'll often see the phoenix and the dragon on the wall above where the couple traditionally sits. Now I've gone over top of the red there and I don't like that, so I'm going to take that off right away. I've just gone a bit too heavy there, and I'm going to take that off right away. There we go. Got a bit too excited about finishing that blue one there. Back up and over, and a little bit light blue over here. And that light blue really brings out that pink color. A bit in here. Just make sure that's all smooth and ready to go. All right. And I think that's pretty good. Now I'm going to lay on a little bit. Oh, I've got a bit of red here. There's always one that you miss, or at least there's always one that I miss. Maybe you guys are really good. I don't know. So now I'm ready to lay on a little bit of the gold. Actually, I'm going to finish off that face first because that's nice and dry now. So I'm going to go in quite a lot of blue, quite heavy, and a nice thin line. So nice tip of the brush there. Make sure I'm comfortable. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to just follow that line and make that nice and dark. And this really is a relaxed brush, really soft. Just let it go, let it flow in so that you can make that line nicely. There we go. It's pretty good. Okay, now I'm going to show you the gold, and then I think I'm going to leave you to try this on your own. One color at a time. Heavy and light pigments, water control. So you'll notice that I have to activate this gold quite a lot more than I have the other paint. That's because the pigment in these ones is extremely finely ground. Now this yellow gold is finely ground as well, but you can't grind it too fine or you lose all that shine from the mica. And so it has to be a little bit bigger. My paintbrush will be a tiny bit fatter as well because it has to hold on to so much there. But that's okay, we'll just work through it. And you want to put this one on. I'm going to just not put it too close to that line up at the top, but you'll notice that it goes on much smoother because I've had to activate it so much, and it's very opaque. So I'm being quite careful about how I draw it through there. And I want to make sure that the pigment has lots of space to flow around and just move and have that nice modality. I want to make sure that my paint never gets thin, because then it's going to leave stroke marks. The gold is actually somewhat more difficult to use, and you don't want it to leave marks from the stroke, so you want to make sure that there's quite a lot of pigment. And you do want to use that only the tip of the brush. You could go down a brush and use a number 1 if you really wanted to, but I don't think you need to. And then what happens if you use a smaller brush is when you get to these big spaces here, you'll end up seeing brush strokes because the paint will get thin in more places. And then you end up with like a patchy gold color. Now this gold from HK Color Lab is extremely good, and it's got a hugely high mica level, pigment and mica level, and it's got excellent binders in it. So it does move very well, and it does stick where you want it to stick, which is handy. But you don't have to be quite as careful with this and hard edges, because the gold is a hard edge. Always. You want it to be nice and thick. It just goes on like a really delicious soup. There we go. And around there. And again, if I make a mistake and I go over a line, number 1, it's pretty opaque, so it covers everything up. But number 2, I can take it off with the towel and I can clean my brush, scrub it, and take it off. But I'm trying to avoid doing that because that does take time, and it can often mean that I have to repaint whole areas, which is not really what I want to do. But you know, if I had to do it, life would go on, right? Okay, so every time I need to activate more, I activate quite a bit, and you can see that I've used this a few times now for different demonstrations, and the hole in the center is getting larger and larger, and I've just made myself like a little well in the middle there. It's plenty of paint for this painting. In fact, it's plenty of paint for probably 2 or 3 of the same painting. I'm going to do a line around the face here because I like to have a line around the face. You might want to try it or not. You might want to try it with pigment. And the secret to lines is smooth, gentle, slow. If you're finding your lines are too thick, it's just a matter of practicing a little bit and being careful how you draw this paintbrush. So watch how I do this circle here. Now I could go around all the way, but it's really awkward for my brush. And I like, with a brush, you want to pull as much as possible. You don't want to push too much. So when I'm doing it, I'm doing whatever I feel is a natural flow of the way the brush should go, and just kind of catching into that rhythm and going with that as much as I can. And I'm going to put another line here. Oh, I'm running out of paint. Really activate that. There we go. Bit more solid line. There we are. I'm going to go inside of this little round bit, and again, I'm going to go around in different ways. And I think that looks pretty good. A little bit more paint, make sure that's nice and activated. And I'm going to go into this space here. And probably, should I do that bit on? Yeah, I might as well. No, I'm not going to. This is, even when I don't have the microphone on, this is often how my conversation with myself goes. Oh, that, no, maybe not. Well, maybe. Kind of decide as I go along. There we are. Nice, smooth space there. Now this is a more advanced painting than some of the others. but it's also very satisfying, especially with this gold. It just looks so great whenever you lay down the gold. This is one of my favorite paints to use. It just adds instant va-va-voom to everything, you know. It's a nice, that's a nice painting. And then, wow, that's a great painting. Look at that gold. Woohoo! So here we go. There we are. And just getting that nice, slow, steady, meditative brushstroke in there. And you can kind of see, if you look on edges and things, you can sort of see where if your gold is getting a bit thin, just to be a bit careful of that. After a little while, and after you've used this gold more times, you'll be able to kind of feel it as it goes along in your brush, how thick or how thin it is. And then I'm going to go and put some in here. That's quite a thin piece, so I'm going to go over it again with a bit more paint on. This paint also dries out very quickly. All the watercolor paints dry out very quickly. So you do need to keep adding water. Water allows the paint to flow, moves it around, and that is essential. Next time I should remember to tape those down so I don't have to hold them down, right? Here we go. Just letting that mica flow through. You can see it moving. It's almost like the paint is alive in these bits here. It's really lovely. Really lovely to use. Again, I want to use the tip of that brush and just let that Phoenix shine. Now I've used this as a natural barrier, so I'm not doing this side of the green tendrils, just the one side. And I've got a tiny bit up here in the mouth, which I'm trying to get, there's a bit more space around the beak there. Obviously, everything is highly stylized. And one of the wonderful things about painting something like this is that you get a real idea of how things are stylized and how the people, a couple of centuries ago would have drawn these on, and the kind of flow that they used. It just brings everything to life a bit more. I personally think that we should be going into museums and galleries with a sketch pad and be looking at art as we're copying it, as we're drawing the lines again. It doesn't really matter if we come up with something that looks like the artist's work, but what happens when you go to copy something or to reproduce something is you end up looking more closely at it. You end up seeing what's actually there rather than looking at it. We don't really look at things a lot of the time. And this process of copying or repainting, or however you want to say it, if we say copy, it sounds really awful, but we're not intending to copy this for, to put it up and say, see, I'm just like the masters. I'm just as good. We're intending to copy to see how something happens. It's a bit like if you see somebody who is maybe walking a little bit funny, you might imitate their walk a little bit. Like maybe you see somebody who's walking with really hunched shoulders and head down. And if you try and imitate their walk a little bit, you often get a feel for how they're feeling. So they might not be having a good day, or somebody who walks with that bounce in their step and they've got a constant, upbeat kind of rhythm. If you copy the way that they move their body, then you might get the same kind of feeling when you move your body in that way. And it's pretty exciting to understand that. And obviously when we're painting or when we're creating things, we are moving our bodies. We're just moving our bodies very subtly in small little ways. And when that happens, it's really quite beautiful. And you can have a feeling or an understanding of how somebody else feels during that time. And it's kind of special, kind of exciting. I'm going way over the line there with that one. But I think I can live with that. So copying, bringing your sketchbook in, just having a go at something, even if you're not producing something that is comparable to the artwork. You know, when you go in and see a Rembrandt exhibition or a Peter Paul Rubens, and they've got these beautiful depictions of people, you might not have the skill level or even the interest in being able to create a face the way that they create a face. Or you go in to see a Picasso exhibition and you're struggling to figure out, how is that drawn? When you do draw it, when you do put it down on paper, when you scribble it on, or you try and reproduce it faithfully, or however you do it, you just get such a good sense of what the artist is feeling and how they're doing. And I think that's quite wonderful. I think that's quite wonderful. There we are. I'm trying to squeeze the last drop of that out there. You can see some parts of it are a little bit thinner than others. Sometimes it helps to move your paper around and just look at the paint and how it's going on. And I'm going to add another bit on here. This is nice and dry already, so I'm going back and adding more on. The way the light falls on this is really important. So it is important to move your paper around, have a look, let it dry, put more paint on. There we go. Looks pretty good. Okay, activate a bit more. And on we go. I want to keep my strokes pulling rather than pushing, because pushing spreads the bristles out of the brush. I know a number 2 doesn't have that many bristles, but it's still important. There we go. Okay, looks pretty good. A bit more paint in there while I have the time. While it's still wet, it's easiest to add pigment to it when it's still wet, especially with the mica and the flow that it has. There we go. And a little bit more around here. There we are. Perfect. Looks pretty good. And around this tendril here. Really let that mica flow around. There we are. Oh, that's a bit too wet up there, I think, almost. But we'll let it dry and see what happens. A little bit in here. And then when I'm finished, this gold, And I'm ready to move on to the next section. I just have a quick look and see if there's anywhere else that I can improve where it needs a little bit more color. And the final touches are going to be sort of the strongest, boldest, straightest color, if that makes sense. So I might go back and, for example, there's a tendril here at the front that might need a bit of a curve. So I'll go back and put a curve on there. And I need to move my head around here, otherwise I have to pick up the paper. You know, you need a lot of light for filming, and it's not very helpful if I'm painting and picking up my paper all the time, because you won't be able to see very well. But it's important for me to be able to see where the mica is going and how that gold goes on, because I don't want it to be patchy. I'm doing all this work. I want it to be nice and smooth. Right? There we are. Another good trick with the mica is going in and kind of tapping your paintbrush in the gold to add more pigment to it. So you just kind of dot, and that adds a bit more to it. That looks pretty good. Yeah, a little bit more right up on here. Now I can go back and add details in now. I want to make sure that I get all of the paint off of my paintbrush. All that mica really sticks in the bristles, so I want to make sure I give it a good swish around. And now I'm going to go in and I'm actually going to put a little bit more color. Oh, I've got one big white spot in there. I missed a bit of gold in there. But I'm going to go back and put, I've always missed a piece. There's always one that's missing. I'm going to go back and just put a little bit of a line around these ones, a little bit more of a line to separate that. I'm going to increase this tendril here and just kind of give these a little bit of a oomph with a fairly dry brush, but with lots of pigment on it. And I'm going to do one more in here. And just get that, he's got this kind of tendril up here by the nose. And I want to make sure that's really emphasized. And it's very easy for me to go in and just do a really solid line there now, because it's really dry and it's ready to go, and it's working out really well. And I'm going to put another tendril over here. There we go. Yeah, looks pretty good. So I've just got that bit of white in there that I need to color in with the gold. Make sure I get all that blue off of my brush. I can test it on the paper or on the tissue. And then I go back in with more water, quite a big dollop of water. Activate it up here. Oops. Activate it so much that it went all over my paper. Activate it up here. And go back in here. There's a big dollop of water there that I'm not so pleased with. But it's easier with the mica to let it just dry out. Patience, patience, patience. I can go back and pick the mica up. It's not hugely easy because it's you know, it's like glitter, only natural, not made out of plastic. It's not hugely easy to pick up every last piece, but it is possible if I want to. So I'm not that concerned about it. Sometimes you just have to accept that not every tiny little piece is going to be absolutely perfect, and to be able to move on from that. When you're comfortable with painting with these guided watercolors, you know, you'll probably try some of your own sketches or some of your own drawings, and you're going to find that it's not always perfect, but it's important to make the first few sketches regardless. Of course, you could just continue on with guided watercolor. That's just fine too. It's a very soothing process. Okay, so that's the first part, the bottom part of the rondelle. And I've painted it pretty much exactly the same way as I painted the first one that I did here. You see, it's pretty much the same. I haven't deviated from the pattern very much, but it's completely up to you how you want that to go, whether you want to deviate, whether you want it to be the same, how you want it to look in the end is completely up to you. Okay, so thank you so much for joining me, and thank you very much for trying out guided watercolor. I hope that you have a lot of fun doing it, and I hope that you find it to be as enjoyable a process as I do. Good luck with the rest of it. Have a look on the website for the guide and see how that goes, and just take your time and enjoy the process. Thank you so much.